When we talked about the if-else statement, I mentioned that it's a control structure and also that there are more control structures, right? Well, one of the other control structures are loop. And so loops are our final big topic in this JavaScript fundamentals section. So loops are a fundamental aspect of every programming language because they basically allow us to automate repetitive tasks. So tasks that we have to perform over and over again. And here I like to use the analogy of a gym. So when you go to a gym, you might, for example, lift weights, right? And let's say that you do 10 repetitions of a certain weightlifting exercise. So we could represent that by doing something like this. So lifting weights repetition 1. And then some more emojis here. Okay, so repetition 1. And remember, we want 10 repetitions. So we would have to paste this code here 10 times. And I don't know even if this are 10 times or not. But anyway, you can start to guess that this is probably not a best practice. Just imagine that we had 30 repetitions instead of just 10. And then if we wanted to, for example, change some word here in this string, then we would have to change that in all of them. So this really violates the don't repeat yourself principle, right? Because we're basically repeating the same code here 10 times, and all we're changing is just this number. So instead of doing all this, we can now create a loop and then put one of these lines of code in there, and the loop will then run that code over and over again until we tell it to stop. And so let's implement a so-called for loop now. And that's a loop which has a counter. So let's do that. And we simply write for and open parentheses. So a little bit like the if statement. And this is a for statement. And so it looks similar. Now the loop statement has 3 parts. The first part is the initial value of a counter. And in the case of this current example, the counter is the value that will start here at number 1 and go all the way to number 10. So let's call this counter rep, which stands for repetition. And so here we literally create a variable called rep. And we start it at 1 because, well, that's our first repetition. Okay? And here we need to use a let variable because this counter will later be updated by the for loop. So that's the first part of the for statement. Then we use semicolon and go to the second part. And the second part is a logical condition that is evaluated before each iteration of the loop. So before each time that the code in the loop is executed. So let me just write it here first, and then this will make more sense. So our condition will be rep needs to stay below or equal 10. So again, this condition that we just described here will be evaluated before each iteration of the loop. Now, if the condition is true, then the next loop iteration will run. But as soon as this condition is false, then the loop stops. And so no more code will then be executed. So basically, the loop will keep running while this condition stays true. And this is really important to realize. And let me actually write that down here for you. So for loop keeps running while condition is true. So this is the kind of notes that I hope that you are taking throughout the course. But this one is really important, and so I wanted to write it down. Okay, and so now I hope it makes sense that we have this condition. Because in each iteration of the loop, the rep counter will get increased. And so at a certain point, it will reach 10. And with 10, this condition is still true. So 10 is still less or equal than 10. But then after that, it will be 11. And so then repetition is no longer less or equal 11, and then the loop will stop. And at that point, we will have printed these 10 strings, basically. So let's continue writing this so that in the end, we actually make that work. So speaking of increasing the counter, that is actually the third part of the for statement. So another semicolon here. And now here we actually update the counter after each iteration. So that's necessary because right now the counter would just stay at 1 forever. And so this condition here would never be false. And so what we do here is to now increase the counter by 1 after each iteration. So we can say rep equal rep plus 1. But does this look familiar to you? So basically increasing the value by just 1. Remember that in the last section, we actually learned about a special operator which does just this, but in a much simpler way. So instead of writing rep equal rep plus 1, we can simply write rep plus plus. And so this will take the rep value and increase it by 1. All right. And now all we have to do is to write the code that we want to be repeated. And so let's copy this string here. Okay. And let's say 1, and then it will print this string 10 times. So let's start with that. And then afterwards, I will show you how we can actually update this number here. But for now, let's try this out. And actually, let's comment this code out so that it doesn't get in our way. So command / for that. And let's go. And indeed, we see that the string was printed 10 times. That's what this 10 here stands for. So the DevTools will not print the same string 10 times. It will simply put this 10 here. But what matters is that this logic here actually worked. So now let's actually use this counter variable that we created here to actually increase the number in the string that we're printing out. So how do you think we will do that? Well, it's actually simple. All we have to do is to replace this number here with the current value of the counter, because this variable that we defined here, so this rep variable, it's just a normal variable, and it's going to be available here inside of this code block. So let's transform this to a template string so that we can then insert that variable into the string. So we get rid of the hard-coded value, and now we basically dynamically build the string. And so here, all we need to do is to put the rep variable. And now we get exactly what we wrote here manually in the beginning, right? So that works. And so let's recap exactly what we did here. So we wanted to log our string here, so a string like this, 10 times. But of course, it could be any other repetitive operation. Again, we're just using console.log here so that we can see the result in the developer console. Anyway, in order to solve this problem of not having to repeat the same code over and over again, we used a for loop. And so we initialized the counter of the loop at 1. So right here, we created this new rep variable, and rep again stands for repetition, but it could be any other variable name, of course. And so we started at 1 because, well, we wanted to start at repetition number 1. But we could also start, of course, at repetition 5. So let's see how that looks like. And then, as you might have expected, the first repetition that's printed is the number 5. Okay, but let's put it back to 1 now. So after each iteration of the loop, we then increase this counter value by exactly 1. And this happens by the end of the iteration. So in the first iteration, this string here is logged to the console with the current repetition, which stands at 1. So this here will be replaced by a 1. And then afterwards, the rep counter will be updated to 2. Then in the next iteration, this same string here is printed, but now with rep at number 2. Then rep is updated from 2 to 3, and so on and so forth. And these loops keep running while the rep variable is less or equal 10. So basically, while this condition here is true. And that's how we achieve exactly 10 repetitions. So what the loop does is to verify before each repetition if our condition here still holds true. And only if it does, it will keep running the loop. So it will execute the next iteration, and so it will execute this block of code here one more time. And of course, we could change it to something else. Let's put it at 30, and then we should get, indeed, 30 repetitions of the same string where only this counter here is changed. All right, and in a nutshell, that's how the for loop works in JavaScript. In the next few videos, we will see some more useful applications of the for loop and also talk about another type of loop that we have in JavaScript.